let's dive into this new release of January 6 tapes. This was something that a lot of the people who were opposed to Speaker McCarthy were enraged by, the fact that he did, Kevin McCarthy, under a lot of pressure, release these tapes to Tucker Carlson, for Tucker Carlson and Fox to go through and report on, but he never made them all public. It was one of the promises they extracted from Mike Johnson when they decided to make him Speaker. He made good on that promise very quickly. Just this, in the last 48, 72 hours, he released a whole bunch of new 9/11, January 6 tapes that nobody had ever seen before, the first time the public gets to see them all. I just want to give viewers who haven't seen it a kind of taste of just one of the videos that shows people coming into the Capitol, not violently, not having to fight their way through, not being stopped by the police, but actually welcomed by the police and marched through the Capitol quite peacefully. Let's take a look at this video. So you don't really obviously hear any audio, of course, but for people listening by podcast, you have these police officers standing on the side. You have Trump supporters who are marching into the Capitol. They're not in any way engaging in any violence. They're not being stopped. In fact, the police seem to be shepherding them in, escorting them in, walking them in. They're being very peaceful. They're walking slowly, walking without having to fight anybody. Some of them are just taking videos. It's very kind of tranquil scene. So, Darren, let me ask you about this video and the new videos we've seen. Obviously, we did learn a lot when Tucker Carlson finally got his hands on them and was able to show us these videos. But before we get into the content of them, just talk about the process. Like when the January 6th committee existed, we saw only the tapes and excerpts that Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and Adam Schiff and Benny Thompson wanted us to see, and they hid everything else. What does it say that it took this long, 2.5 years almost 3 full years, to be able to have the public see all of the videos, not just the videos they wanted us to see?
Well, there's been a severe reluctance on the part of the mainstream media and the regime to allow the public to see any direct footage of January 6th that could complicate or contradict the official narrative that's been shoved down our throats every day for years now. And that narrative is that January 6th is some sort of horrific, unique event of domestic terror that exceeds even 9/11. And I think Biden even said at one point exceeds the Civil War in terms of the trauma that inflicted on the country. They've invested a tremendous amount of money and resources and attention in crystallizing that narrative because it's used as a pretext to further the weaponization of the national security state against the American people. So there's a lot riding on it, and anything that challenges that narrative, certainly I've experienced it directly because Revolver News was at the forefront of challenging various aspects of that official narrative. And so this footage is in that vein. I think anyone who's paid close attention to the issue already knew that the Capitol Police provoked the crowd gratuitously with flashbangs and so forth. Anyone paying attention would have already known that the Capitol Police in many instances opened the doors to the crowd and so forth. But developments such as this, where the footage becomes more widely available and at scale, like the full range of footage, is very important because it reinforces the understanding that's already been out there by some of the researchers like we've been doing, Julie Kelly and others. And it allows the public to really understand what really happened, and the public that hasn't really paid much attention to it. And so I think it's very significant that this came out for a variety of reasons. And my understanding is there's going to be still more footage. So a lot of people who may not have paid attention to it, they see this video and they say, this is not what they've been telling me. every day for years now.
You know, the amazing thing, too, is the role of the media. Obviously, the media paid enormous amounts of attention to January 6th. You could argue it's one of the 2 or 3 top stories to which they paid attention for obvious reasons since it happened. Usually when there's material that the government has relevant to a story the media is covering, one of the duties of the media is to insist on transparency, to press for it, to ask for it, to complain that the government's not releasing it, and then ultimately to sue under Freedom of Information Act or other kinds of provisions that force the government to release it. That's one of the jobs of journalists by definition. And we were talking about this last week in the context of the shooting, the mass shooting at that Christian school by that trans woman who wrote a manifesto, killed 6 people, 3 of whom were 9-year-old students. The others were 60-year-old teachers who left a manifesto. Usually the media feasts on these manifestos, wants to get their hands on them so they can figure out what conservative pundits or politicians to blame for having caused the violence, to claim that the people that they were radicalized by this person or that person. And in this case, we haven't gotten the manifesto for 7 or 8 months. The Nashville Police Department, the FBI, have had all sorts of obviously pretextual reasons why they can't release it, including claiming there's an ongoing investigation still to determine if there was a co-conspirator when everybody knows this person acted alone. There's nothing to investigate. They just don't want this leaking. And then we finally got a few pages through Steven Crowder, and they immediately big teched, banned it from even being discussed. And in this case, you had almost nobody in the media doing things like retaining counsel. We retained counsel in Nashville. By that point, there were other lawsuits already pending, and they just told us you can repeat it, but you know these lawsuits are going to make their way through the courts, and now they are. But the same thing happened here with January 6th, a much bigger story. I don't think there were any media outlets trying to pressure the government to release the footage. Why do you think that is?
Well, it depends what kind of pressure you mean. I think there are a lot of people who have been saying the full range of footage should be released to the public and not undergo any kind of process of mediation.
Right. I'm sorry. I meant like media corporations, like large media corporations, like the New York Times, NBC, CNN have not been suing, have not been demanding. That's all I meant. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, their vested interest is basically on the narrative that they'd already been promoting. And I mean, I suspect that they did have access to it. And based on that access, they selectively presented the footage that best solidified their narrative. And what's ironic about that is, for instance, there was a very carefully curated video montage or short documentary thing the New York Times did called January 6th Day of Rage, in which in their full range of footage, they selected the clips that most darkly and ominously suggested a pre-planned attack on the Capitol. And guess who appears not once, but twice in this short montage is none other than Ray Epps. So before the New York Times was publishing fully dedicated puff pieces to Epps, they thought that his participation was so egregious that in the mountains of footage they had access to, it warranted 2 appearances in their montage designed to portray the narrative that this was a pre-planned event of domestic terrorism. So there's a lot of interesting twists and turns when you look into it.
For sure, and I want to ask you about Ray Epps in a second. That was something I was planning on asking about, and I want to get to that in a minute. But before I get to that, there was violence on that day. There were clashes between protesters and police, as we've seen in so many protests of various kinds over the last, say, couple decades in the United States. And well before that, I mean, in the 60s, there used to be these kinds of protests all the time where protesters and police would fight against each other. So there was violence. There was some clashes between protesters and police. Some police ended up injured. But what do these clips that we hadn't yet seen until just now, things like them entering the Capitol without any attempt to stop them, what did they show us that narrative that we've been fed excluded?
Well, and again, like we've already seen this type of footage, but it simply reinforces the fact that in the overwhelming majority of cases, it was people who had been let in or were, went in largely unopposed, who weren't destructive, did not destroy any property, did not assault any officers, and just kind of went with the flow of what must have been a very surreal experience of kind of people just rolling through the Capitol and sort of taking pictures and marveling at how bizarre the whole experience was. And then they're out of the Capitol 5 minutes later in many instances. Then the next thing they know, they're treated like Osama bin Laden. I mean, I think that's the story of a lot of people who just kind of got caught up in the crowd psychology. But if the crowd is going in, the cops aren't opposing. And in many cases, they're opening the door and fist bumping people and chatting with people and so forth. You don't really register that you're putting yourself in a position of of a future domestic terrorist. And then you mosey on through for 5 minutes, take a few pictures, text your relatives on this is crazy, I'm in the Capitol, and then you leave. And then the next thing you know, your entire life is ruined and turned upside down. So I think the video footage kind of reinforces that reality and helps us to understand how that could be the case. And as for the other aspect of the footage, on the outside of the Capitol, it shows, again, these gratuitous actions of provocation from the Capitol Police, the flashbangs and things like this that really provoked the crowd. And I think a lot of the violent behavior we saw on the part of the crowd was actually agitated and precipitated by these actions of the Capitol Police that may or may not have been given the green light from above.
Yeah, to this day, it amazes me, that of all the people charged and prosecuted in the January 6th cases, a small percentage of them were accused of using violence. The vast majority of them, the government acknowledges, did not in fact use violence. And yet we watch people convicted of nonviolent protest crimes, like the Q shaman, for example, who went to prison for a long time. For years, people got prison sentences of years or many months, pre-trial detention, even though they were never accused of any violence. And it's unbelievable to me to watch left liberals cheer and applaud and support not just the prosecution, but the imprisonment of nonviolent protesters, political protesters, given the precedents then this has created, and the sorts of things they've always said. All right, let's talk about your friend Ray Epps. We've talked many times about him on this show. You've been elsewhere talking about him. Other conservative journalists and pundits have spoken about him, raising questions like he seems to have played a very central role in a lot of these events. You see him on video. As you said, the New York Times featured him twice, thinking he was a pretty important person. He was on tape really provoking people to storm the Capitol, to use violence, revving them up. And yet, as all these people that we just talked about went to prison, Ray Epps never did, and it raised the question of why that was. He insisted he had never worked for the FBI, threatened to sue people. I think he now has sued a couple of people, including Tucker Carlson, who insinuated that he might have worked for the government. He now has been charged. He pled guilty to a misdemeanor one misdemeanor count. I don't believe he got a prison term, or if he did, it was very short. Does the fact that he's now finally been charged and pled guilty change your mind about some of the questions surrounding him?
No, not at all. I mean, it seems like a very desperate attempt to patch things up, but it's too little too late. You can't wait over 2 years after when all is said and done and then slap him with a misdemeanor charge that doesn't even match, the same, charging of other, people who've gotten misdemeanors, let alone, obstruction of official proceeding, felony. And there's so many other charges available to the Department of Justice. They wanted to use them. They didn't have to wait this long, and they could have very easily given him much more severe charges. And of course, they don't have to, but the manner in which they exercise prosecutorial discretion is very telling, because very early on, a guy named Michael Sherwin, who is in charge of these prosecutions, who advocated infamously a shock and awe approach to arresting as many people before Biden's inauguration. He, I think, reasonably stated that, look, we're going after the conspicuous cases, the cases of people like the Q shaman who were kind of publicly flouting us. The more visible cases were the ones that they wanted to exercise their prosecutorial discretion to make an example of. And Ray Epps was among the most visible, if not the most visible. He was one of the first 20 people put on the FBI's most wanted list. As I mentioned, of all the footage the New York Times could have chosen to reinforce their ominous narrative, they chose Epps. And they chose him for a reason. He was a very public figure with a sort of made for TV, made for virality moment saying we need to go into the Capitol, into the Capitol. A guy, a former Marine in camouflage with a Trump hat telling the crowds to go into the Capitol, who, by the way, people forget this, he was the former head of the Arizona chapter of the Oath Keepers, the most demonized and heavily prosecuted militia group associated with January 6th, other than arguably the Proud Boys. So with all of this stuff on paper, he would be exactly the kind of person they'd want to make an example of, and they had very easy indictments on him from the very beginning. And not only did they wait over 2 years to do a sham misdemeanor, which they warned him about in advance, in contrast to all the other people who've gotten the SWAT treatment of, the guns bursting down the doors at 3 a.m. They just said, oh, by the way, Epps, we want to inform you, you're going to get a misdemeanor charge now over 2 years later. And by the way, this charge, which, fits into the theory of these ridiculous defamation suits that he has. So it's all, so convenient for him. So the short answer is no. I don't think a misdemeanor charge over 2 years after the fact changes anything, but underscores how desperate the regime is to tie up loose ends when it's too little too late. Just to tie in quickly to something you were talking about earlier in your monologue, guess who the lawyer, the Ray Epps' lawyer, his representation for these defamation cases, guess who he's worked for and he works for now?
Is it Media Matters?
None other. Well, not quite, but
Or
close.
David Brock? Yeah.
Yep. So the fact that now David Brock is in, the orbit of Ray Epps as indirectly supporting Ray Epps' defamation suits, which at least until now are technically just against Fox News, not against Tucker or myself,
Right.
although we feature prominently within the defamation suit. But it's pretty remarkable that that David Brock, a lawyer that worked for David Brock, who is of the law firm Perkins Coie, which in a variety of contexts sits at the intersection of the Democrats and the national security state, that this should be the individual to represent Epps. And I don't know whether Epps actually has to pay for him or whether it's pro bono or something else, but
I'd be shocked if you're talking about this is a major law firm in Washington and elsewhere. They played a major role in the interaction with Russiagate and the Democrats and the security state with Democratic Party voting suits of all kinds. It's an extremely expensive firm. I seriously doubt Ray Epps has the ability to pay for it. The way in which Ray Epps has been turned into a political cause, every single other person at 9/11, January 6th rather, has been talked about as a Satanist, as you said, as like almost a member of Al-Qaeda or worse. And yet the media has defended Ray Epps so vigorously, as have Democrats from the very beginning. They went so out of their way to be able to charge everybody there with felonies. We've talked about before the way they had to stretch these precedents, use this Sarbanes act in order that was really designed to punish people who had done things like impede the Enron investigation by trying to turn this into some sort of interference with an official investigation to turn it into a felony, something that law had never intended to cover before. And yet they went out of their way to make sure Ray Epps got charged with a misdemeanor, even though his involvement was so much greater, as was reflected by the fact that the New York Times was featuring him, as you said. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.